And we are super excited to share with you the findings of the Dutch Dialogues report here this evening. And you may be asking yourself, why is Historic Charleston Foundation, a preservation nonprofit, spearheading this effort? It might seem a little counterintuitive. But for us, the issue of flooding and sea level rise directly intersects with our work protecting the historic assets and livability of the Lowcountry. And believe it or not, preservation is as much about the future as it is about the past. First, I'd like to recognize and thank all of our incredible sponsors of the Dutch Dialogues Charleston project. Principal sponsor and partner in this is, of course, the City of Charleston. We've worked with the Medical University of South Carolina, the Nature Conservancy, the American Flood Coalition, Charleston Water System, and the Royal Netherlands Embassy in Washington. Also, we've had generous private contributions from Davis and Floyd, Thomas and Hutton, and AECOM that have all helped to underwrite the community engagement and educational outreach aspects of this project, much like this event that we're having this evening. So thank you very much to all of them. Now, the success of this project has absolutely hinged on its collaborative spirit, bringing together scientists and designers, academics and practitioners, neighborhood activists, and city officials, and also all the various city departments that work on resiliency. When I was lucky enough to join the special delegation that went to the Netherlands last fall, it was really inspiring to see all the various city officials brainstorming together and thinking outside the box on this issue of sea level rise and stormwater and flooding. And it was that positive energy that we really wanted to bring to Charleston through the Dutch Dialogues, and I'm very happy to report that it worked, and I feel that it's been infectious and it's really spread throughout this entire community. Moving forward, the success of this report will hinge on an all-hands-on-deck approach to the implementation of the recommendations that we'll hear about in a minute. We are all, and I mean all, going to have to work together to shift the paradigm on how we address flooding and water management. This includes all levels of government, our institutional partners, the business community, and the general public. Our ambition is to speak with a unified voice in order to establish priorities and approaches for this monumental challenge ahead of us. So please, please help us. You'll be hearing from us. The work is just starting, and we're going to need your help. Lastly, I'd really like to thank sort of the principal architects of this project. First, Dale Morris, who you're going to hear from in a minute, of the Water Institute of the Gulf, and David Wagner of Wagner and Ball Architects in New Orleans. They're sort of partners in crime on the Dutch Dialogues, and they've been one of the most incredible and inspiring consultant teams that I've ever worked with. It's really been an amazing collaborative effort, and I really appreciate. We've forged a great friendship, and they promise us that they'll stick with us. They're not going away after this evening. So thank you very much for all your work. So I'd now like to invite Mayor Tecklenburg to the podium to make his introductory remarks. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. And thanks again to Winslow Hasty. And I also want to shout out to the staff, Holland Williams. Where's Holland? She's helped every step along the way here. She's also with the Historic Charleston Foundation. And they've done a remarkable job serving as the primary sponsor here locally for Dutch Dialogues Charleston. And I got to shout out to the Dutch and to their government for them to participate in an initiative like this in a place far away from the Netherlands. They're just remarkable experts at managing water because they've been dealing with it for over 1,000 years, So just a little history. Just after I got sworn in as mayor almost 4 years ago, I went to the U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting in Washington, D.C., and they would have little things that you could do in the evening, and I spotted one to be a visit to the ambassador of the Netherlands residence for a presentation about something called Dutch dialogues that they had done in New Orleans. And we had just had, if you remember, in fall of 2015, the amazing flooding, terrible flooding from Joaquin. And so obviously that piqued my interest. I went to his residence, and it was a nice reception as well. And Mayor Mitch Landrer from New Orleans was there and gave this presentation along with Dale Morris, who at the time was working for the embassy, about how the Dutch had brought their expertise on the matters of flooding and drainage to help the city of New Orleans after Katrina. And I thought, gee, well, I want one of those if we can get it. And it was accentuated later that year when we had Hurricane Matthew. So again, in D.C., the conference has an annual meeting up there the next January. I went again to the ambassador's residence, but this time dedicated to asking him if he would please bring this initiative to Charleston. And you know what he told me, and this is why I'm so thankful to him, that this is a purposeful part of the Dutch government's foreign policy to help countries and cities and places around the world that need help with their expertise. So I want to call to stand up and be recognized representatives from the Dutch government who are with us this evening, Jan Paling and Consul General from Atlanta, Kosha DeVries. Would y'all please stand up and be recognized? We thank you for your goodwill and your help to our country. We really appreciate it. We will hear soon from the Water Institute of the Gulf and Wagner and Ball. I do want to recognize any city council members that are here because they've also supported this effort. I see Councilmember Carol Jackson with us and Councilmember Dudley Gregory. I saw Councilmember Gary White there in the back. Any others? And Councilmember Mike Seekins is back here as well. So thank you all for being here and for your support. And both Councilmember Gregory and Councilmember Seekins joined us on our trip last year to the Netherlands. So we had that request to the ambassador, Ambassador Henne Schurer, and in fact, he came to Charleston, it's been almost 2 years ago now, to scope out whether he wanted to make this commitment. He decided he would. Then we took a team to the Netherlands about a year ago, not quite, and saw the remarkable measures and projects and the mindset that they have. And so here's the thing about the Dutch that I think we Americans either never got or never figured out along the way as well as they did. And that is to use Mother Nature to its best effect and pay water a little more respect, if you will. I mean, in a way, we always treated water like the enemy. You know, we had to fight Mother Nature and push it out and all like that. But we need to incorporate what they're recommending to us, and that's finding a place for water. Be a little more respectful of water. If you can, reuse water, capture water so you can water your garden, or every drop counts that comes to us from the sky, and every drop that we can conserve and reuse is another drop that's not going into our storm drain system and clogging up our storm drains. So this is truly an effort that we're all in this boat together of dealing with this issue of drainage and flooding and sea level rise in the city of Charleston. You all know statistics, and some of them are more gloomy than others, but reality, sea level has risen just over a foot in Charleston Harbor in the last 100 years. Now, that may not sound like a whole lot, just over a foot, but in the last 20 years, the rate of increase has quadrupled. And very simple math, you'll see right here, if things don't get worse, and many people think it will, you'll see a 2 to 3 feet rise in sea level right here in Charleston. So we need these strategies, not just the projects we've been working on, but this mindset of utilizing water and finding a space for water. And they've also confirmed to us the importance of new regulations or governance on future development. So we do no harm when we build something to surrounding properties. So we're more mindful of where we build, of our land use, so that we don't make the same mistakes that we've often made over the last 350 years in building in the wrong places. So together with this Dutch Dialogue's Charleston plan, along with the city's flooding and sea level rise strategy, there is truly a vision that together as a community, we will meet this challenge of flooding and sea level rise in Charleston and the Low Country. Without further ado, I give you the president of the Water Institute of the Gulf, Justin Aaronworth. Justin.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out. My name is Justin Aaronworth, and I have the great honor to serve as the president of the Water Institute. And first, let me make a few very brief thank yous. I really want to thank Winslow and his team. They've been just a remarkable partner. It's been great to get to know you and your team. Same with the mayor and all the members of council who are here, and so many of you who have participated in this process. And as both Winslow and the mayor said, you know, from our perspective, we're all just beginning on this journey. And it's a journey that the Water Institute has been on for some time in Louisiana. And, you know, as I've been here, every now and again someone asks a question, so you live in New Orleans and you're from Louisiana. What are you doing in Charleston? What do you have to offer? And part of our story really is that after Hurricane Katrina, we understood even better than we did before the challenges that we had in South Louisiana. And so we went around the world looking for who has figured out how to deal with water the best. And our eyes, of course, went to the Netherlands, because the Dutch have been defending their coastline for the last 800 years. And in 1953, they had a horrific storm. Some have called it their Katrina moment, where over 1,200 people died. And the Dutch said, never again. They said, never again. And they did a couple of very important things. They built remarkable flood control projects that we all can and have learned from. The other thing they did is they invested in real applied science, and they built institutions. There was a group in the Netherlands, a group named Deltaris, 850 of the most brilliant coastal scientists that you'll find in the world, and that group became the model for what is the Water Institute. So we got started in Louisiana, and over there, we face an existential crisis. We lose a football field of land in Louisiana every 90 minutes. And there's a complicated story for why. It has to do with putting levees along the Mississippi River, and, you know, historically, back to what both Winslow and the mayor said around, you know, harnessing the power of nature. Historically, the Mississippi River would flood, and that sediment from the river, which drains 40% of the United States, would go over the banks and replenish the land. Well, we built levees that allowed, on the good side, that the river wouldn't flood. On the bad side, we cut off our oxygen source, our sediment. And so instead of flooding and going over the banks, the sediment goes off the outer continental shelf. So that's caused a real challenge for us. And over the last, since the 1930s, we've lost the land mass of about the size of the state of Delaware. Think about that for a moment. There are countries that have gone to war to protect that amount of land. It really is a crisis for us. And what we've done, and why there's great hope, is we've invested deeply in a science-based process based on the Dutch model. And we've learned a great deal, and we continue to learn a great deal. And so I tell you that to introduce my colleagues from the Water Institute and Wagner and Ball for this reason. We've learned a good bit in Louisiana, and when we come to South Carolina, when we come to Charleston, we learn even more. We've learned so much from all of you, from so many people who've been a part of this process. And it's a great honor for us to be able to give some of our ideas and some of our insights and learn in that process. Because, you know, especially in New Orleans around Mardi Gras, God bless us, we think we're real special and unique. But as it turns out, our challenges that we face in Louisiana, the challenges that you face in Charleston, are not unique. There are communities all over the world who are watching this process, who are watching us in Louisiana, watching us in other coastal communities and saying, how are they going to survive? How are they going to adapt? And what we believe is that using sound science and with strong community participation, we can solve these challenges. And I'll close with this and introduce my colleague, Dale Morrison, right now. But one of the things we have in big letters up on the walls in our offices in Louisiana is a quote from Albert Einstein. And what he said essentially was, you cannot solve the problems of today with the same thinking that was used to generate them. We have to change our mindset. And that's what this process has really been about. That's what we have learned. It has been very humbling for us to learn through the experience in Louisiana, and very humbling to come here and be able to engage and share ideas and share knowledge with you. It has been just an absolute honor. So thank you for walking with us to this point, and we're really excited for all the steps to come. And so with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague Dale Morris and thank him and David Wagner for their great leadership of this process. Dale Morris, ladies and gentlemen.
Wow, there's a lot of people here. You know, when you go to events and it's talking about flooding, you don't get this kind of a turnout. So it must be something, it must be a boring night in Charleston, I don't know. I'm Dale Morris. I worked at the Netherlands Embassy for years, coordinating the Dutch government's water work in the U.S. Came to New Orleans post-Katrina, saw some things. David and Wagner and I met. We worked through this Dutch dialogues process. It's an iterative process that we help to create and we guide. It's been effective elsewhere. I moved to the Water Institute because of the Dutch relationship, Del Taurus and the Water Institute, and now I'm there. But the mayor cajoled Justin to allow us to continue to do the Dutch dialogues process. And David is here. He's the design lead and really the creative mind behind a lot of this. So it's been a process. We're going to talk about the report. The report's available online, DutchDialoguesCharleston.org. For those of you who don't have an unlimited data plan, maybe wait till you get the Wi-Fi. It's 80 megabytes compressed, so there it is, but you need to look at it. You're going to hear us. We're going to talk about 3 to 5% of it. Spend some time with it, please. The report overview, I just want to direct you through this as you go, as you open it and look at it. Look at the scope that the city gave us or we developed. That explains what we were asked to do. We weren't asked to give you engineering plans. We were asked to give you a vision based upon a lot of knowledge we've developed and created elsewhere with other folks to see how it can inform here and see if it's adaptable here. The foreword, it explains how we look at this opportunity and your challenge, because they're both there. Look at the maps. Maps are at the front of every narrative chapter on the zones we looked at. Spend your time, put your glasses on, look at the colors, and understand what that means, please. This will convey a lot of information to you about your risk, about your landscape, and about the foundation of our recommendations. Spend your time there. Please read the narratives. There are a lot of recommendations through there. You're going to hear some from David. You're going to hear some from Andy, who's going to do the reports on the other part of this. And spread throughout the report are sidebars, a number of one-pager type things. These are things we want you to know. These are things we think you should understand and maybe develop here. And these are things that we also think that could inspire you. So look at the entire report. It's 250 pages. There's a test at the end of next week. Our agenda tonight, again, we've talked about the report, talk a little about our process and our stakeholders very quickly. I want to talk about our principles, talk about our general recommendations. They're spread throughout the report, but just going to underline those. And David and Andy are going to talk about the various narratives. And I wanted to go back. Sorry, I should have done this. It's in the flyer you have. But in this process, in our scope, we looked at 4 zones: Johns Island, Church Creek, the east side of the peninsula and the medical district, and places nearby. We could have looked at other places, but this was our scope because these are typologies that are transferable elsewhere. You can look at these zones and understand what you can do elsewhere. It's important to understand that we couldn't cover the entire place in literally 9 months. So this is your risk. Understand this, the slide on the left with all the hurricane storm tracks. This is going to happen. You just had a near miss a little bit ago, and you've had some experiences in the last couple years. This is going to continue to happen. So you can prepare for it, or you can respond to it. Preparedness is cheaper. The risk, the little graph on the other side, these things, these flood events, and this is stormwater and tidal flooding and big storms, they're coming more often. They're going to continue to come even more often as the sea level rise and the tides increase. So if you do nothing, it's going to be really hard to live here. Understand that, please. And your challenges, very briefly, you have increased flooding from a number of different sources, and the impacts of those types of flooding are different, but you get water in places that you don't want, and it hurts people in place and capital. You have this development pressure. This is an opportunity as well as a pressure, and you need to look at it that way. Development can occur wisely, or it can occur unwisely. When you develop in a low-lying area with a lot of flood risk, that is not wise. And we talk a little bit about that, about how you think going forward of where you should not develop. And we're not against development. We're just saying develop wisely. And you look at your identity here. We all love Charleston. I've adopted it. Hope you've adopted me. But really, you have an identity and you're a distinct place. It would be awful to lose this. You all know that. But I'm here to underline that for you. Don't lose this place. The key dates, we started this process, as the mayor said a long time ago, doing a lot of reconnaissance and investigation and talking with folks. We kicked it off in January this year. Your report's in front of you, available tonight. A lot of things happened, a very intense process, a lot of stakeholders involved with it. And I don't want to belabor this point, but we had terrific support from your city staff, from the mayor's staff, but also a lot of other folks. This slide or this information is in the report. You can get an understanding of how many people we engaged with in this process, because we understand your version of the problem definition and also your understanding of possible solutions or desirable solutions, and we tried to incorporate that. Again, a lot of stakeholders, very important to understand. We learned and we tried to engage that. This is a slide would like you to look at in the page in the report. We heard a lot of things, and then we captured that and put it on this page. See if you recognize yourself in here, because we think you will. And it also guided us as we came up with our solutions. A little bit about the principles. And I don't want to belabor these, but really, these are things that guided us. They guide us before we came here, but they guide us really here in Charleston. Your natural systems matter. This environment is dynamic, but it's also robust. It creates resiliency, it creates risk, but they matter, and you need to understand them, you need to respect them, you need to manage, and you need to embrace water. The mayor is absolutely right. Embrace the water, because it can do a lot for you. Beware of manipulating it. Safety first, right? People, place, and capital should not be put at risk if you can avoid it. It's just a fundamental principle for us, and you need to go forward. You need to occupy this landscape sustainably, and that may mean people have to move. That may mean in places a retreat. It may mean in places a little more density. But you can live here as you adapt. And we've changed over time. You can continue to change and evolve. Preparedness. The Army Corps of Engineers, the World Bank, a lot of folks, it is much cheaper and less expensive to prepare for a storm and mitigate the impacts than respond to it and respond to all the disruption that occurs. This is from a capital expenditure, and this is from a personal loss of life and the impacts that happens with people's lives. And we need to be, humble. We don't know everything. You don't know everything. The science is changing. We're getting better. But let's be humble about this process. Let's not have hubris. Let's be humble. This next one is very important to us, and it's worldwide. Adapt your development to the existing water systems. Don't adapt the water systems to your development, because you're probably going to have some negative experiences if you do the latter. Very important. Embrace this uncertainty. Again, your projects, as you put them forward and you build them out, they must be adaptable. The sea level is going to rise. Your tidal interface is going to change. How you deal with this, especially with the perimeter protection system that is being thought of now by the Army Corps of Engineers for the Peninsula, or even projects over on Johns Island or West Ashley, If you don't make these projects adaptable to change, so you can change them as the conditions evolve, it's going to be a regret. It's going to be a loss of money. You won't be happy with that. So embrace this uncertainty. So you're all property owners in one way or the other. The city uses your taxes to do things with, right? Business has a lot to say here and a lot at risk. The property that you have here is a depreciating asset when it's at risk for flooding. That is an awful thing for a lot of folks. So understand that and try to flip that around, please. And the last, key principle for us, the costs come before the benefits. So what does that mean? It means nothing is free. This statement is on top of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the oldest stock exchange in the world. The costs come before the benefits. Apple doesn't develop the phones we love unless they get some seed capital. That's an investment. And all these things we're going to show you tonight, these are investments. And they're not free. It's going to cost something. We're not going to benefit from it. You will. So keep that in mind. Some of our general recommendations, and I'm going to really turn it over to David and Andy real soon here. Slow, store, drain. You will see this throughout our report. What we mean here is, the mayor talked about this, when the rain falls, store it on the high ground. Create places for that water to go. The moment it falls, you have some very good soils here that can absorb a lot of water, and you will see how much in one of the slides that David or Andy will show. Store it in your natural creeks, in your natural drainage areas. You have space. You need to divert the water there that you can't store or infiltrate on high ground. You need to divert it there so it doesn't overwhelm your low ground drainage systems. And drain it when you can, and drain it efficiently. The city's making awesome investments in some of the drainage here on the peninsula. These are necessary. Slow, store, and drain. We really think, David and I and a lot of others, that Charleston needs a water plan. There's one other city in the United States that has a water plan. We were part of it. It's New Orleans. It has really changed the mentality of how people look at things. This allows you to assess the various conditions you have, the physical conditions with the water system, groundwater, occupation, the soils. It allows you to develop water assignments so you know exactly how much water you need to store, either infiltrate or store or move around when things occur so you don't get flooded. And we think this water plan, like in New Orleans, it should have the force of law, and it should guide the comprehensive plan and your zoning ordinance. Because when you get that, then water will be a decision in it'll be a factor in every decision you make. In the Netherlands, the water board's there, so the authority over water, they get, when a developer comes in with a proposal, they have what's called the water test. And if they say it doesn't work, the project goes back to the drawing board until it works to store the water. This is important. And we would recommend something like that develop here. And this can't be developed overnight, but it should be developed over time. Markets and policies. Markets can do a lot for you. Markets can create efficiency. You have a number of vested rights, properties that's low-lying throughout this zone, throughout this area. We have to respect that. Private property is important. But we also have to understand you can't develop anywhere. So the people that have vested rights, if we can create tools, or you can create tools, stormwater credits, conservation agents, transfer of development rights, a number of different policies will help the market to move this property around so the developers can do what they need to do, the owners can do what they need to do, and you can create the space to store this water in low ground. This is an important policy tool, and the markets will help you out. They won't get you all the way, but they'll get you pretty far. Business leadership. Business has a lot at risk. Your tourist industry is very vulnerable to this flooding. Some of your, just there's a lot of risk here. The leadership of this is very important. They can provide cover and advice for the politicians. They have a lot of employees that are at risk, so they need to engage more and not just wait to see what's happening at the political level. And you all, everyone in this room, you have a responsibility to store stormwater. And there are ways to do this. The city of Amsterdam has a rainproof program, and it's an inspiration, and the city of Charleston is looking at that. You need this cultural awareness and a cultural responsibility of what you can do to store the stormwater, because by doing that, you will reduce all the risk downstream from you. Very important thing. Regional governance. Charleston sits really in this very important zone but your floodplain is how the water moves. Your water system is how the water moves, and you need a governance aspect over top of this water system that can inform how you approach and coordinate and streamline the investments. Because if it's the city doing one thing and the county doing one thing and someone else doing one thing, you're lacking efficiency at scale. You're lacking efficiency across your water system. So please, look at this governance issue. And as Justin, we talked about this morning, a coastal master plan would be a really good thing because it'll allow great efficiency across the coast. And by golly, when bad things happen and storms come along, the example from Louisiana is that this allows the federal dollars, which can take 2, 3, 4, 5 years to get on the ground, it allows them to occur and get on the ground much faster, multiple of 50 or 100% faster. It's very important. Natural systems matter. And I'm going to segue to Andy as he comes up here. I'm going to talk about this. One of the things we looked at was a regional coastal protection system. We're not talking about the perimeter protection system on the way for the peninsula, but a regional coastal protection system. And we had some of the best minds in the world looking, could you put structural surge barriers out at the mouth of the harbor and on the Stono River? Could you do this, and would it work? And how much risk would it reduce? It's what the Dutch did. It's what New Orleans has in some places. Boston is thinking about it. New York's thinking about it. Would that work here? It would deal with your surge risk. It won't. Your benefit cost ratios that are really needed to allow these things to go forward won't work. It's our analysis. But what we do know is your natural coastal system, your dunes and your ridges, your forest canopy, all that works very well. And that is part of an integrated system. So these natural systems that you have can provide a lot of protection. We know they provide a lot of beauty. They provide a nice place to live, but they can do a lot for you to dampen surge. With that in mind, so natural systems matter. Andy, you want to come up? Thank you. Thank you all.
Good evening. My name is Andy Sternad. I'm an architect and urban designer at Wagner and Ball in New Orleans. And excuse my tie, I know Charleston has more bow ties per capita than probably anywhere else, but we're technically off the clock, I guess. But I'm going to walk you through the coastal zone and the areas to the west of the Ashley River, and our thinking and recommendations for these areas. Now, the coastal zone writ large was not technically part of our scope for this project, but we have to zoom out that far to understand the landscape itself and the opportunities in it for water storage, for safety, for risk reduction. So when you zoom out to the whole Charleston metro, the low country region, you see this pattern of parallel ridges to the coast, sand ridges, former sand dunes where old coastlines used to be. And so we understand that this place and this coastline is naturally in flux. As the seas change over time, deep into ancient time, the sea level rises and falls, the coastline comes in and out and builds up these dune structures. Those are now the highest points in the landscape here. They're the safest points. They're the most structurally sound points to build on. They're the best for infiltrating stormwater. Many, many opportunities if you understand how that landscape is formed and where that formation is located. Another important thing, building on what Dale said, is this studying the natural lines of defense, the multiple lines of defense for various regions around the coast. The sea islands themselves are a line of defense. The barrier islands along the shore aren't the only one. There's a series of landscape features like Johns Island, James Island, Wadmalaw that protect what's behind it. So Johns Island is really the front line barrier for West Ashley and parts of the peninsula behind. Again, briefly, we just looked at the natural lines of defense, the kinds of things you would do in New Orleans, other coastal places, adding dunes, reinforcing dunes, making communities more resilient. These are all really good ideas. These should be explored further in a regional plan. We looked again at that structural line of defense, not recommended, mostly for cost, but also because when you draw a line in the sand that way in a landscape that naturally moves in flux, the risk builds behind it. You're not able to adapt as well when you fix that point. So that's part of the natural solution and part of working with the way the salt marsh tends to migrate other aspects of this landscape, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So recommendations, I'd encourage you to refer to the report. I'm just going to skim through these recommendations for all the sections, but no engineered hurricane protection system is recommended for the coast as a single barrier line. Nature first. So Johns Island. It's one of the largest islands on the East Coast. It's also some of the highest ground in Metro Charleston. The ridge along Maybank Highway is one of those old barrier sand ridges, one of the most stable structures in the region, and a pretty good place to locate people versus lower down towards the salt marsh. And I'll get to the importance of those levels in a little bit. Johns Island is a character-setting place for the region. As an outsider, when I think of Charleston, I think of nature and history. I think of the amazing natural assets here, the amazing historic assets. On Johns Island, you have both. They're kind of one and the same. The historic community, the Gullah community, and then this amazing tree canopy that's really unlike many other places on the East Coast. That's something to conserve, and I'll get there again. Hold that in mind. And then you have new development. You have some development that's elevated, some more suburban style, some more dense than others. Development, like Dale alluded to, is an opportunity. It's a sign of the desirability of this place. People want to be here, and there's opportunity here. That should be reinforced. We can't stop that, and but we can't love it to death. And that's a key point on Johns Island. We need to help guide it and guide development in a way that aligns with landscape principles. So rainfall flood risk, I think you all know this even better than I do from living here, the importance of rainfall and managing that volume that falls from the sky. I encourage you to look more towards the report for a little more detail. That's an important thing to consider on Johns Island and everywhere. But the driving risk on Johns Island, the highest priority risk is storm surge, closer to the sea. And the storm surge risk level sets the development priorities in our mind and our recommendation. So here you see some historic events charted across. We've used these historic events and storm surge levels to set up 4 zones across Johns Island, 4 zones based on elevation, the height of the topography, to recommend types of development. So first, between 0 and 6 feet above sea level, we call the wet zone. We don't recommend any development in that zone. That's a place that's almost always wet today, will only become more so in the future. That's a place where the salt marsh currently exists and a place where the marsh needs to migrate through, as it naturally will do, to buffer the existing development higher up over time. Next zone is 6 to 10 feet. That's the ecological zone, we're calling it. Limited development in this area, very limited, only raised foundation, no fill, except for critical access on roads. It's really important to maintain tree canopy here, maintain the natural ability of the landscape to soak up water like a sponge. Next zone is 10 to 15 feet, the transition zone, slightly more development. Next above that, community zone, the highest ground, the most stable ground, the safest place to put people, ultimately trying to keep people out of harm's way on Johns Island and everywhere. The higher, the better. This curve is projected to grow with sea level rise. So 2 feet, 3 feet, you need to think about critical facilities, how you protect critical places, how you keep people out of that future risk. It's something that needs to be revisited. It's naturally in flux. So you see that critical 10-foot line between ecological zone and transition where more building is recommended. Currently, that's a 100-year return period. That's a storm you could expect once in 100 years. We know that's happening much more frequently. And with sea level rise, the 100-year storm happens much sooner, much more often. You experience that high water. Even more important to keep people high up, not build low down, even if it's on fill. It's a naturally wet landscape. So these 4 zones in plan view, looking down, kind of don't make much sense. It's sort of like that topography map, but kind of squirrely. If you cut a section through and look at the elevations, then I think you understand more clearly what that means. So trying to keep people out of the low areas, the salt marshes, the Burden Creek outflow, trying to keep people higher up close to Maybank Highway, largely within the urban growth boundary in that area, aligning with the Johns Island Master Plan in many cases. It's a recommendation we'll come back to. But one important thing to notice in this drawing is that blue dashed line kind of arcing like a rainbow. That's the groundwater level. The groundwater level is lower the higher you go, maybe counterintuitively. That means there's more space to store rainfall in the ground on the ridges. The water level is closer to the ground surface, higher down. So that's an opportunity. That's an opportunity development should leverage in that area. So recommendations, refer you to the report again in more detail. The critical thing is not to build low down, build high up, and eliminate fill as much as possible. Maintain the tree canopy, maintain the native soils. So wet zone kind of give you a sense of the character, moving up, maintain the canopy in the marsh, slightly more development as you get higher, not very much fill, and then the community zone, maybe taking a little bit different form than the development that's happening now. Importance of maintaining the soils. Typical development, the most cost-effective development scrapes everything, starts over. That native soil, that top layer, permits more infiltration. It's a sponge itself and should be maintained as much as possible. That might change the way development looks a little bit in this area. That is just good practice. You have to use what nature gives you to make it stronger. That soil infiltration, again, on the high ground in the green boxes, there's a huge amount of freeboard capacity, dry space within the first part of the soil where you can store rainwater before it flows down and floods your neighbors farther down the watershed. Again, prioritizing that groundwater recharge everywhere possible, especially on the high ground where development is recommended to be densest. So it's maybe counterintuitive, store more water where you put more people, but that's the opportunity here. Maybank to Marsh is about an awareness of the whole watershed and how that aligns with the urban growth boundary. That edge of the boundary where you're transitioning from high down to low, maybe there's still some development allowed there, but you need to be really careful about what the watersheds look like and how the landscape naturally functions here, or else people are going to be wet and they're going to be put at risk. So vision for island life, development in nature as one, conserving the natural assets that are there, that's really important. Conserve what's there. You can't get it back. You can't get these trees back. You can't get that native topsoil back. And then last one to highlight here is the market-based tools. There's an inherent value in the land that's been entitled already for future development on Johns Island. The development community is an important player in this story, and market-based tools can help sustain the value of that property that's already embedded in the entitlement while facilitating some of these other goals, conserving nature, moving around property ownership. We can't just stick our heads in the sand and say, I wish you wouldn't do that. We have to use tools to facilitate change. Market-based tools, transfer development rights, conservation use easements, these are one way to do it, and there's more information in the report. Okay, west of Ashley and Church Creek, I think this is, it's interesting to compare these two. Johns Island is sort of a don't mess it up. Church Creek is kind of, it's already been pretty messed up, and now it's a retrofit of what's there. And that kind of messing up goes way back to the phosphate mining. It's a deep historical change in that landscape. It no longer functions like it did, with drastic consequences today. Church Creek is similar in landscape to Johns Island. It's a little bit lower. However, the driving risk we see as rainfall. It's not so much storm surge. It's a little farther inland. It's a little bit buffered. But you still have tidal influence throughout Church Creek and some of the other basins. That's an important thing, and I'll get there in a second. This area used to be a swamp. It was basically flat and always wet. And if it rains, if there's a rain bomb in a swamp, it doesn't make the news. And you can imagine what happens today. The landscape has that memory, and that's still how it functions. This isn't Church Creek, obviously, but it's the vascular systems present in nature. The land and water operate in a similar kind of vascular way, and we need to understand how the watersheds work together with the land and development. Development has to conform to the water, not the other way around. Pre-development, very wet, very swampy, bare swamp. Early development was characterized by the phosphate minings up near up near River Road. Basically strip mining, scraping the landscape away and completely changing the hydrology of the place. And you see the kind of intensity of that landscape change for phosphates 100 years ago. You still see, if you're driving up River Road, these ridges and valleys filled with water kind of in the trees. That's a legacy of this history. Present infrastructure, those waterways, those natural, wide, broad, swampy waterways have been constricted. They've been put in pipes and they've been narrowed. But the landscape surrounding them hasn't forgotten that it used to be wet. And so we have these legacy impacts. You see on the left is the shadow moss buyout. This is one possible outcome. Maybe there's more. And you see those structures that remain, like Crosstown Church right off Bees Ferry. This is a regular occurrence there. It's pretty extreme. So we have these legacy impacts to deal with. There may be more conversations about buyouts. In other places we've worked, we've called that a buy-in. You keep communities together, give opportunities to locate nearby. Maybe it's a way to strengthen communities around education, around knowledge of the landscape, the place where people live. Many people don't know they live in a floodplain, and they can't really be held accountable for that. You have to have some compassion, I think. If we look at the watershed approach, though, for West Ashley, a couple of recommendations become clear. So if you look in the upper left, there's that upland swamp, that phosphate mine. That area operates as sort of an independent watershed. Then there's the kind of brownish, which is all draining towards the Ashley River, and then the greenish draining towards the Stono. And you see the red line is Bees Ferry with the circle there, kind of right at the split in the watershed. Overlaying a couple of recommendations, up in the phosphate mines, maybe we create a detention swamp. What if we could store all the water that falls there and prevent it from coming downstream? It's a matter of holding it there, but also maybe additional outlets to the Ashley River at that point. Within the developed watershed, Church Creek Basin, we see an opportunity to connect to the Stono River, provide more outlets. Maybe there's a way to provide more outlets to the Ashley, but you could also connect down to the Stono. There's already a water control structure in West Ashley Park, and that connection could be improved. So then we advise to make room for water throughout the watershed. The former creeks have been constricted. They really should be allowed to widen again. So you get from what was the constricted floodways more room. There are people living there right now. That's something that needs to be addressed going forward through a watershed plan. Here's the control structure at West Ashley Park, and the ways that you might divert water in some cases to different outlets and facilitate that flow back through a constricted landscape. It's important this room for water ties into the coastal issues through the tidal marsh, the salt marsh. That marsh serves as a sponge for stormwater. It soaks up the water that falls. It should be maintained, and as sea level rises, it will migrate horizontally up to a point if the rise is within a certain range. So that sponge effect will migrate inland and can be utilized if it's allowed to, if there's room and it's not interrupted by infrastructure. Within everywhere, John's Church, everywhere, retrofits at the property and street scale can store more water. That's just a basic. Everybody has a part to play. In the report, there's a section of recommendations that we received and welcomed from the development community. These are not something that we wrote, but echo a lot of the same thinking, maybe with a different perspective. So read that for what it is, and I think it's a relationship that's important to this region, a conversation that needs to continue, bringing everyone to the table. So before I hand it over to David, I just emphasize in Church Creek, it's judo, it's not boxing. The water's there, it's coming. If you try to fight it, it's going to overwhelm you. Judo is taking down, using the force of water that's already inherent in that system to live there more sustainably. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. I see people in the audience who've worked with us, and I hope you get a sense of, you can look at this and see maybe the recommendations, the words supplement, amplify. Dutch Dialogues has always been a design-driven process. Sometimes we draw before we know. So there are many people in this room who knew more than we did and helped us draw as we've drawn. I'm going to talk about the peninsula, and unlike the islands, this is a place that structural protection comes around to be have a cost-benefit ratio that's easy enough to prove. It's to me, Charleston's a museum. It's a wonderful, fantastic, relatively small place. That size, that moderate size, gives you an opportunity to do something spectacular, as has been done for 350 years. The topography's pretty clear. King Street's high. The people who first built knew the high road, and you can see it. You see the colors. I hope most of you can read these drawings. If you look at the urban character of the city, but you can't come in and say, I'm going to take the peninsula in Charleston and just put Amsterdam on it. You have to look at the condition that exists here. So you've got this beautiful battery as the water control structure. People knew where the force of the wind and water came. The grid here is particularly well scaled. If you study urban grids, there are people who fascinated on where the 260 feet is better than 280 feet. That's not really the point, but you have a very tight and wonderful grid, which gives you these lines and this transparency that's also then buffered by the trees and the canopy. It's still hot. We're Southerners, we're from New Orleans, you know, it's going to break, we're going to get to fall someday. But even then, this is still, even in the fall, it's framing our views and giving us place and character. It's also giving us a species with whom we can live. Maybe we get along better with trees than one another. I don't know. I do. But then I'm an architect, and we're always taught about this vernacular of the Charleston house. This, whether it was for tax reasons or other reasons, it's created a unique urban vernacular. So those are things to which we pay attention and would honor. We were asked to look at the east side where the bridge ramp was removed, and you know the east side is really a revelation in terms of its character. I don't know how many east side residents are here tonight. Thank you. I think, you know, it's again this edge condition that was in the marsh. It's got some, you can see the blue line on that map, I believe, that you can see the extent of the east side. It's really two creeks, Vardells and New Market. Every city on the East Coast seems to have a New Market Creek. It's got these problems that are endemic, you know, the King and Yuji condition, which is really caught between the high line, the ridge, and the low line, which is this constructed railroad, and it floods because it's trapped in between. So that's sort of the upslope condition there. We take this more and more, you know, and get into the retain, store, drain, you know, detain it, if you want to call that, instead of store, and then drain it when necessary. You know, in Norfolk, Virginia, where we've worked and do work, it's drain when possible because they have no defense system. So it can only go out when the tide goes down. You are likely to get a defense system which will give you an edge, which will give you something to pump over, but you don't want to be pumping all the time. I live in New Orleans. We've pumped ourselves to 8 feet below sea level. So how much rain? This is a methodology. Which are you going to do? You're going to do the heavy storm, the rain bomb that Andy's talking about? You're going to count that? We measured this against something you should be able to count and look at, Marion Square up to your waist. That's that many Marion Squares you have to store water. So it's a lot of water that you need to store. And that's not the Houston rainfall, that's your predicted rainfall. Or is it the 24-hour storm, which is in some ways easier to manage because you have more time and there's more ability to distribute that water. Nonetheless, this is what we call a water assignment. If you as citizens start to look at where I can put water, where we can store water, I think you might read your landscape differently. It's really important that you start to read your landscape. There are tools and technologies and ways to store water. Streets are our common property. So that's a good place to start. We reconstruct streets in cycles. When you reconstruct a street in Charleston, it should store more water. So you have these tools and you have these interventions, and whether you do a minimum, a mid, or a maximum scenario depends upon how you want to count. Because remember, you have a water assignment. How much do you want to store? Because you'd rather not flood. Flood has increasing cost. Dale's the economist. I'm just an architect. Public parcels are public, good place to work, parks and schools. You get multiple benefits. You get a cooler environment, and you get educated kids. So if you can look particularly at these places and you can understand how to use them, then you pick up another large piece of this water assignment by looking at public parcels. You can see opportunities that are particular. This goes back to King and Eugene. You see the instant homes, and you know there's a bioswale. Perhaps if you start to look, there's a bioswale there impeded. And then the question I think that we would have to explore is how far is the tidal exchange coming in, and what happens if you let it go under the low line. So it's then coming back to your property. So we're Americans. We have our private property. We have our land. What do we do with it? You know, we get it out to somebody else's property and we complain when it comes back at us. It really doesn't have that far to go. So there's a lot we can do on our own land, on our own roofs, in our own gardens. So there are really a lot of recommendations that the East Side community made. It was a profound meeting we had with them. They say, you know, Charleston is the holy city. It's the first time I've really heard people say the blue laws were a good thing because they organized our society. Well, maybe so in orange buildings that are, you know, pretty modest restaurants. can be cultural icons. We have to make each of our places more unique. We cannot lose the character that makes Charleston, Charleston. This is a historic city, but it's ridden with lots of character and a lot of stories, not all wonderful. But inside the story, we find meaning. So there's a vision for the east side. It includes more water. It's especially along that former bridge right away. But it's a story about flooding. You know, what are we going to do so that the people can no longer have to suffer that and they get this new urban spine? So this new urban spine that comes through the neighborhood there, we think is quite doable. A really good thing. It's really kind of beginning to restore a creek, and sometimes the creek wants to reappear anyway. So this is just letting nature in more quickly in conjunction with community and in conjunction with this idea of the holy city and the church that's raised and not razed and demolished. It's important that we do these things. It's important this not be in the distant future. This should be in the midterm. This is a community that would be quite advantaged by our attention. So there's a vision here that involves more longer-term thinking. What would happen with the port in the future? When is that line of defense going to be located? Where is that going to be located? A critical question, and not for me to lecture you about right now. I'd like to grapple with that later. But you can see this list here, and you know, maybe the thing to point out here are really the partnerships, you know, educating the kids, trying to get everybody involved in the east side, working with the people there and respecting them and their territory. So that would be one side of the peninsula. On the west side of the peninsula, you've got your regional economic driver. I don't know exactly the percentage of the economy, but it's big. But it's not just the economy. It can be life and death. And so a place that floods that we depend on for critical services is kind of dumb. I mean, you really don't want the way between you and that door and a fire to be blocked by water. So, you know, what are we going to do? Well, one way to do it is put in these big engineering structures, and we do admire this in a way because this is different. It comes back to your geology and these drop shafts that are in there, and this system is a solution at scale for the medical district. But again, the medical district is built in a marsh, built in a swamp, built off the edge of the peninsula and fill, so it's got a lot of operational questions. I think a lot of places that exist in low-lying conditions wish they were in Kansas City or somewhere else. They aren't. We aren't. We have to build more specifically to where we are. And we have to look at the opportunities that we have. I think the west edge of this, the west side of this peninsula has beautiful opportunities. You go there for baseball, but there are many more things that can happen in that condition. We admire the master plan for the medical university, the medical district, the three hospitals there. The water addition, I believe, is coming more quickly now. You know, it was a green way, it's a blue way, it's going to be wetter, we need more water to deal with this. There was a group working in the Dutch Dialogues workshop that was looking at how do you pay for it, because we know you have to pay for it. Well, working together is a better way to pay for it, and I believe these institutions are starting to work more quickly together. Critical access is vital. There need to be more than one way. We identified these varieties of ways. And then you have to understand that some of these roads are too low. I mean, not only the ones that serve the police, but also the ones that serve the medical district. And if you're building inside a medical district, you can get into the second floor, and that raised street can then be water storage. And there's some things you can do at this institutional scale that are pretty interesting and they are done elsewhere. You shouldn't have to go to Hamburg to find anything done with an elevated street. So there are different ways to build in different conditions, and when you build next to a home, it can't be that kind of structure. It's got to be a more tailor-made sort of structure, because you're trying to deal with somebody's front door in that case and not overwhelm that. So there's some recommendations in the plan that you can see along Haygood and Gadsden Creek about trying to keep the road from overwhelming that historic area. So trying to build things that are at the right scale. Design is all about scale. And so then how does that creek interface here, and how's the green piece of that and the blue piece of that, and what's the exchange, and what's the control, and how do you leverage all the good work that's been going on there? So there is a series of alternatives about the medical district. You don't have to do all these things, but we've laid out a series of alternatives, street by street, trying to get you back to where it's fitting into the urban grid better, trying to make it safer to get to the medical district to come and go. One of the first discussions we had at Wagner and Ball about coming to Charleston was from the Flood Coalition, because they wanted to build a wall to keep the water out of the medical district. That was the problem that needed to be solved. It's not the only problem that needs to be solved. I hope you already get that. There are many more things we can do. But there is an issue of edge protection here. There is an edge protection condition apart from the high and low battery, which are being established, and I don't know what the prices came in today for the bid on the low battery. But there are alternatives about where you locate those edge protections. Do you raise lockwood? How do you deal with this edge? I mean, there are 2 versions right here, 3 versions on the slide before, where we've drawn or sketched opportunities for locating this protection as a raised street or as a wall. What is it doing with the marsh on the outside? What is it doing with the water storage on the inside when you do that? These aren't they aren't determined by single variables. They're multi-variable questions. My long-term business partner, Mac Ball, the Balls of Charleston, 17th century, they came here, did this because his father's doctor's office was across from that. He said, well, what if you just lose Lockwood at this point? Don't imagine that would go over in the traffic planning world, but from his perspective, where his father's office was, it would be workable. So this long-term issue that you're facing now about where you put the perimeter first line of defense plays up along the west side. And, you know, the medical district recommendations, there are many there, and which one would be most salient? Maybe the real-time forecasting is most salient here, because if you're in a critical emergency, you need to know exactly what's happening right now. And there are, in the book, recommendations about real-time forecasting. So there are multiple recommendations through this book. I hope those of you who have a good a data plan will download it. It's 8.5 by 11, so you should be able to. It's double-sided. Okay, so concluding then with the Peninsula, you know, the icon of the city. This storm surge thing, you know, they were pretty good when they built the high battery. They really fairly much understood how high the river was. The mayor told you it's a foot higher now. It's going 2 feet higher. How high is this water? Just how high is the water? It's a Johnny Cash song that I felt pretty badly after Katrina. Mother, how high is the water? It keeps going higher. So how high is the defense line? How much is that going to be? The Corps is studying now. I don't know how many people from the Corps are here tonight, but they've been engaged through the process. They have different metrics of what justifies what decision points they have to make. We need to engage with them. We've done this in New Orleans with more or less success. We've tried in Norfolk where they're looking at defense. You need to engage this process. So this way of understanding that the Corps' thinking can be complemented by other ways of thinking that the Dutch might bring, about thinking about the soils, thinking about the subsidence. Where are we going to put this line? What's going to be the effect of that line on this really pretty curious geology that we have? This little peak in this marshy condition along the rivers. One of our friends suggested that we consider it as an autonomous line that becomes free as it goes to the west. There are impacts, environmental and others. The key point of this part of the recommendation is that you need to develop a system. You don't want to think about this as I'm going to build a flood wall. That's not thinking in systems. It's not going to make a more beautiful city. It's not going to make you Charleston. It's going to put a wall around you like we have a wall around New Orleans. But you are likely to get this, hopefully not because you have a hurricane next year. We've told you that it's really important to elevate all the times, but it's really important to do spot elevations because you've got a lot of low points in your street systems, and if you raise those local conditions, you can fix local flooding problems. amplifying your deep tunnel system is a good idea. Perhaps it could even be connected and you'd get a lot more capacity. And as we would ask, what are you doing with the water that's down in there? That's valuable. Why are we trying to get rid of it? What else could we do to use it? Could you cool your city with it? The Dutch would think, well, that's obvious. Shouldn't only be the Dutch who are smart. Sorry. We have a problem with tidal control. You know, our outlets are inlets. You know, it doesn't go out anymore, it comes in. You know, why is water in my yard on Thanksgiving? It didn't rain. So we have a real long-term problem with a shallow drainage system. Slowing and storing, everybody's talked about it. I've talked about it. Andy's talked about it. Get the water in the ground. It's the largest organ we have, the skin, the earth. Well, we need a new drainage strategy, perhaps, and why would we take the high water and let it get down to the low land where we really could keep it up higher and we could use it higher, so intercepting that at a higher level is part of a long-term recommendation. But as it all comes together, what I notice is that there's water behind that line stored. And everywhere that I see a smart water system with a pump, it's got a lake in front of it. We don't have that in New Orleans. A drop of water has to be pumped to the sea. So storage of water, space for water inside that line is a vital consideration. You do not have it at the battery, and you'll have very expensive tunnel construction. As you adapt, and as this area, as this peninsula transfers into a polder system, a water management unit from within, a Dutch term that came out of the farm, but here in a highly urbanized way where you've got an interior water management system. So that's the sort of transformation you get to where you start to build this defense and you start to get water at the edge that you can then manage so that you stay here in a freshwater condition with the seas rising and the rivers around you. When do you make the investment? When do you move in this direction? This process is meant to be directional. It's not meant to be a final recommendation. It could not be. But when do you make the decision that I'm going to put my money? Remember, the Corps is going to locate that line very soon. And remember, one of Dale's principles, I believe you had up there, was no regrets. Fairly good idea. You don't want to do something you regret too much. It's time to make some long-term decisions sooner than maybe we are ready to pay for them. But our incremental investments turn into that system. So what do we take? A no regrets measure. Those recommendations you can see in the report. We've taken this approach all the way through from the ground up. The infrastructure and networks are in the middle, and we live up here. And we benefit to the degree we're in harmony with these systems, especially with the ground. So our phrase, living with water, that we started using and put a little mark on and get a website a long time back, is reality to us. We're not going to get rid of it. Why would we? The mayor knows how much of it's in my brain, and maybe not enough. I should have more right now. But we learned a lot in Louisiana. This is not just the Dutch. You know, the way that this, America works is not like the Dutch. I'm sorry, we're not logical that way. You know, 4-to-1 investment is not something we necessarily make, return. But we have to learn from everywhere, and we can't just say it's difficult. Some of this stuff is difficult, and you can't say, oh, it's just difficult, I'm not going to be able to do anything about it. Or like my Chinese friends will say when they want to tell me, no, it's inconvenient. It's inconvenient. But that's not good enough. So what I would really ask you to do is love this place and, commit to it. So, Terry, I say, do you have any questions? Dale, Andy, Winslow, anyone else, please help. I think we're through for this round.
So we asked that the difficult questions be directed to the mayor. No, we're here to help. A lot of recommendations in the report. You haven't digested it. Please ask questions. We're happy to explain until we have to leave. Mark Wilbert from the city is going to come up. He can help us navigate some of this. So that's nice. I mean, I really like Mark. He's been perhaps the most crucial person in our interface with the city. I would applaud him, and he didn't get any boos from you, so I guess we're all pretty good. That's great. And there's a microphone right here. If you want to come up and ask the question, that way everyone else can hear it, because some people have the same question.
I'll start with a really dumb one. I'm shocked that we have land that's 15 feet up. You basically say we should only build when the land is 15 feet or higher. Where is that? I feel like all of us are living in the 6 feet and under areas.
That recommendation is specific to Johns Island. You have elevation over there. Andy showed it. Looking at the peninsula, you're already developed here. So this perimeter protection, that's going to be, we think that's a given at some point in the next 100 years, probably a lot sooner. So you can't sort of do that. But any future development, we know the mistakes of the past. We can see them, not just in Charleston, but a lot of other places. So learn from that. And we know the seas are rising, so don't develop in low places because they're going to get more risky and you're going to cause more harm to more people. That's our recommendation. That's for new development.
Have there been any numbers put to the general cost to fix the problem? And if so, how long do you see it would take to alleviate most of the problems that were discussed tonight?
That's a Mark question. I would say, so in our work, these are not engineered plans. These are designed. That we talk with a lot of engineers to understand what's possible and what's likely and what would be least costly and more costly. But this was not an engineering plan. I said this won't be inexpensive. Before I let Mark give you the answer, I'm going to give you the economic answer. You're already spending money. Dorian passed, and you don't think it cost you a cent. You're absolutely wrong. The mayor had to send out the emergency manager. Mark had to work overtime. The tree folks had to come in and remove debris. The medical district had to put sandbags down, whatever they do. You're spending money right now because you're not mitigating or prepared for your risk. So I think when you think of, oh, this is going to cost more money than I think what you need to understand is what you're spending now that you wouldn't have to spend, and then add the incremental top to do this other stuff. So the other stuff is Mark's answer.
We get this question every time, and I'm going to answer it the way I think that's probably the best way to answer it. One is, if you go on our website, we have completely outlined every project that we have underway today, and we've put the estimated cost on there. And those are there. We've made it extremely transparent to take a look at. In addition to that, you've heard several times tonight, we're going to have to do a perimeter protection, likely around the peninsula. That cost is yet to be determined, but then you start adding that cost to it. And as you begin to add these up, I think you can get a sense of what the cost will be. And it's going to be a big number. It's going to be a very big number. But we do have time on our side in some areas. We're coming to a point, I think, in the city, I think the mayor would agree with this, and I think everybody behind me would agree, we're going to get to a point where we can really begin to set these priorities. What has to come first, what comes second, and it's not going to be just one or the other, but it could be a number of several that are first, second, and third. But that's going to be clear in the not-too-distant future. If I gave you a number now, it'll end up in the paper and it'll stay there forever. But what I'm saying is that we've made everything that we have available to look at, and we know what's still out there. You all know what's out there. We've been making it available. So I would say start adding it up. It's going to be a big number, but we have a lot of time, relatively, to do all of it. We've got to start. We've already started. I would say you'll find we've really started. If you take a look at the projects we're doing, there's a lot more to do, but we have time to do it.
Thank you very much to the team. A lot of us were here as community leaders and elected officials this morning, so more of my council colleagues were here, several of the other municipalities that were hoping to take on this more regional water planning approach. But today you gave us more of a challenge and a directive as the people who are responsible to get started now that you've delivered this plan. So I would appreciate it if, Dale, you would give the same kind of challenge tonight so that our citizens can hear what you told us this morning.
So So the council was sitting in a similar constellation over here, most of the council. And I will say, Councilman Seekings is here. He was here, I saw him. Councilman Jackson. So they were both really active participants through these workshops. They engaged. I think they learned something. They had some fun. So we thank them for that engagement. Other councilmen have talked to us over the last project cycle. Very important feedback from them. Someone asked the question about cost. Money will come to you after disasters, and so you need to prepare for that. Money is coming to you from 2016 and 2017 already. The state is getting it, and some of it will come here. Use it wisely, prioritize it, and spend it. You're going to have to look at what's the local match for that money is. Where's that going to come from? There are various ways to get resources. And again, when you start looking at what you're already spending and you turn that into an avoided loss number, the numbers can start to add up. But the council needs to adopt a number of policies that allow these things or force these things to occur. We have recommendations in the report. Council needs to adopt transfer of development rights, stormwater credits, stormwater easements, conservation easements. They need to develop incentives to allow the developers to put in green infrastructure. And they need to develop incentives to allow homeowners to do some of the same things. They need to make sure, perhaps with a water plan, that the water assignments that are there become everyone's responsibility. And the comprehensive code that you're going to renew next year and the zoning ordinance that governs everything you do is sensitive to that water plan. These are things that are going to have to occur once you have the sense that every decision you make can be viewed through this water lens, even some of your transportation infrastructure money. And money is fungible, but you have more needs than just water. Water is an important one. So you need to start thinking about how do you aggregate all of these decisions with water always in your mind. What can you do with whatever project you're going to fund, whether it's a new school or street rebuild, just a lot of different things. That water viewpoint on that would be essential. And this will not occur overnight. We're not asking you to do this in the next council session. There's a lot of advice you need. There's a lot of engagement that you need to go through with, what's the exact appetite for this with the city. But start the process now. And in 20 years, if you do this in a year, you get these things moving, in 20 years, you will see a different place. The Netherlands really adopted this living with water mindset only 30 years ago. Before it was fight the water. Masters of the universe. When I make my recommendations about be humble, the Dutch are undoing some of the environmental damage they cause by fighting the water all the time. So they're very good engineers and they've learned from their mistakes. But this living with water thing, and they're experts at it now, but we have some good knowledge too in the US. You can transform this place over a generation. It's not tomorrow, but you need to start tomorrow.
Yeah, let me just say, political leadership is vital, but business and community leadership is too. You can't, they're mirrors of one another. Industry, Justin was talking about the money in Louisiana. Well, there are industries that have grown up around that. I don't know if it's 4% of the Dutch economy is in the water sector. There's money to be made. James Carville, some of you know, looks at the water plant in New Orleans and says, look how much money businesses should be able to make doing this. We've lost that inventive side. So don't just defer to the political side. Understand there's a business responsibility in this too.
Thank you all for your work here. I think we all really appreciate the emphasis on nature-based infrastructure and preserving our natural areas, as well as the policy of diverting development away from low-lying areas. I think you got into this just a minute ago a little bit with your answer, but I was wondering if any of you could elaborate on policies or lessons learned from implementation of policies in either Louisiana or the Netherlands that deal directly with diverting development out of low-lying areas. So actually putting that into action and what the best ways are to avoid, any conflicts, make sure that goes forward smoothly. Thank you.
So it's really difficult to talk about the way the Dutch do this, simply because they have a different constitutional system. They're tiny and tight, unified. The water threat is their primary water threat, or their primary environmental threat, so they deal with it well. They don't deal with wildfires or tornadoes or things like that. So again, the Dutch mindset is to do this. So their governance models are set up for this, so they're efficient. In the US, the last 10 years, you see more and more cities trying to struggle with this. You see unstructured retreat occurring in a lot of places. It's a lost opportunity. You see more and more places starting to think about strategic retreat. You had a bit of that in Shadow Moss. So how does this occur? I would direct you, and it's in the report, we have a couple pieces of information on what Norfolk has done, partially inspired by the Dutch dialogues we did there in 2015. They have a new resilience ordinance and a Vision 2100, and they are setting forth on maps with streets exactly where they want to focus development and exactly where people are eventually probably going to have to move away from. So we all buy, Americans on average, I'm this economist, right? I have all these dumb statistics. We move on average once every 7 years. So as that marketing process, that market development process occurs, we can make these changes and create the direction and the incentives to allow them to occur. And this is easier than I think. It's not easy, but it doesn't have to be so hard. So I direct you to those two things. I think they're in the appendices of the report. Okay?
I just want to say the conservation part, I thought you were also asking too, and you could have a lot of regrets if you cut the angel oak or something like that. So the conservation of our natural assets is not something that the movement should sacrifice. We see in Louisiana that the high land is sacrificed to single-family housing. We don't have that much high land. It's being used inefficiently. So you need to think about efficient use of your high land.
So the Army Corps of Engineers led a project in New Orleans for $14.5 billion that I understand is already starting to fail. So when I hear about getting the Army Corps to build a wall around the peninsula, I'm concerned that it might fail. And I sensed in your presentation some reluctance to really advocate fully for that and warn that we might regret taking this step if we do it too quickly or without a concern of that we'd be fighting the water.
So the $14.5 billion investment in New Orleans was post-Katrina. There were many authorized projects to protect New Orleans, manage its water better, that were, in federal dollar terms, authorized. They weren't appropriated. So the system that was protecting New Orleans, that Congress had approved, they just hadn't approved the money for. And Katrina comes along, and some of the flooding occurred because of the weaknesses in the system, because the processes, the projects that were authorized weren't built. So the system was incomplete. So the Army Corps of Engineers, you spent your money to fix that system. So now they've raised it up to the standard, the 1 in 100 protection standard. They did a very good job. However, if you put something heavy on top of something soft, if you put a brick on top of a sponge, it's going to sink over time. Subsidence occurs. In the Netherlands, they have to top up their levees. They lift their levees every 20 years because the soil underneath is very soft. So this story about, well, they spent the money and it's not worth, that's an incomplete story of what's happening there. So these investments that you make over time in hard infrastructure, one of our recommendations is you need to operate them and maintain them. And so this operation and maintenance costs money. And what they're saying is they're going to have to do another lift on some of that protection system around New Orleans to make it up, to bring it up to the legal standard of the 1 in 100 standard. So that's what happened there. Pardon me? Sooner than and that is the weight of the structure, you know, the science is there that this is going to sink. How quickly it sinks, you just don't know. But they always knew that they're going to have to lift these things. And as the water level outside it rises, to maintain that risk profile, you're going to have to increase some height. But at some point, you can't go any higher because the heaviness is going to compact the soil. So these are dynamic scientific things. We understand a lot about this, or the real engineers understand a lot about this. So you can do this, but that investment worked very well. Some storms have come through New Orleans since that was rebuilt, since that system was fully built out, and it has worked well. But it has some negative impacts. And one of the things that David hinted at, and I'm going to give it to him, is in our mindset, Charleston will probably not, given sea level rise, the peninsula will probably not be able to survive without some perimeter protection system. Just our mindset. Just because it's so low. It deserves to survive. So you make this investment because the benefit-cost ratios, which are very important, they work because the peninsula is so dense and so important and has so much value. But when you put that alignment there, and I'm going to give it to David, you need to be very careful about what kind of city you're going to have after you put that wall in or that structure in. And it needs to be multiple benefit, and it needs to work with the character of the city. And David?
I get nervous when I lived in New Orleans at Katrina, and, I get nervous because it failed 30-something places. The New Orleans defense system was it was a system in name only. They said it had a lot of long lines that came in. The hurricane defense system came into these canals, these long fingers that ran into the city. Nobody fights a war by inviting the enemy into the middle of the city. New Orleans is vast. New Orleans had 630,000 people, I believe, in the 1960s, and we added 60 square miles, and we're at 400,000 people. So we have not enough people for the density of a system. You have a really small defendable area here. You're not talking about the same scale of effort. You're not talking, therefore, about the same scale of perpetual maintenance because you are perpetually maintaining a line of defense. So remember, we also showed you the soils map, and that's where it fails. It fails in the underground. So you have to really understand where you're putting loads and all that, and then look at that. But you want to build the most economical, and that would be efficient, small system as you can, really. You don't want to go pick up the extra 60 square miles where a few people live. That's why the recommendation about not the protection system in the West. So the numbers we can do, we can't do right now, but they're just order of magnitude different.
I had a question, and one of the previous people asked something about this, but I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on the managed retreat, but also with a consideration for some of us in Charleston have undergone what I would consider to be an unmanaged retreat, and we have many people that are living in an impossible situation right now, and so I just was kind of wondering if you could expand a bit, maybe Dale or David, about the compassion that you talked about to people that are living in an unmanaged retreat or have had to undergo an unmanaged retreat.
Louisiana teaches you a lot of lessons you don't really want. Where one of the projects that Andy and I are working on is the relocation of the Ile de John Charles Island people, the native people. The community's broken. There are only 30 households or so that are there to be relocated. It took too long. What we see is the poorest people are left in the lowest places, and the communities are broken and so forth. So you have to really engage this. It's got to be a fair trade. Most of this is about trading. You're going to get something and you're going to give something because the government's not going to move too many more island populations. So managed retreat is preferable, I think, to this attrition that we've seen along our coast. Money moves away from risk. So it's happening. People are retreating. They're moving up. But the poorest people, and maybe the people who say, well, this is how I'm going to end my life, are down there. And the people who want to catch the fish. There's always a reason to be in the lowland. We shouldn't act like the water has not got value. That's a key point in Louisiana, maybe. Here, it's always known because you see it. But management retreat requires cooperation. Water forces that. We have to get further along than we are, because right now it's just the poor people are losing, I'm afraid.
And let me add this. We're not advocating for unmanaged retreat. What we're saying, there's unmanaged retreat going on everywhere. Have you been to the Rockaways? So you know where that is, right? That's that area, that barrier island that Sandy destroyed. There's unmanaged retreat there. And if you look at the redevelopment that's occurred there, it isn't very nice. So our idea here is you make these investments. Houston has gone through the same thing, right? How many storms in the last 4 years of that? So you can allow these storms to overwhelm you, or you can invest in advance. You may have to have retreat. It's better if it's structured and planned and allowed to occur dynamic or with market forces over time than this sort of wall of water that destroys lives and destroys people. So we're trying to say, if you develop this, we think it would give you a way to have managed retreats in some places, but we also think you can stay here because your system, certainly out in the west of Ashley, it's dynamic enough that you can probably continue to live here if you don't develop unwisely, right? So that's, and the perimeter, the peninsula, it's like Amsterdam. You don't want to lose it, so you make the investment that you need, but make it multifunctional and operational and beautiful. That's, okay.
I'd just like to quickly say, I see people are starting to peel away. We have time for one more question, but we are going to stay up here, and people will be here for individual questions if you all want to chat, but I apologize. Sorry, Rich, but Mr. Hamilton.
My name's William Hamilton. I'm the Executive Director of Best Friends of Low Country Transit. My house is 10.5 feet above sea level. Well, that's the ground, and the house is 4 feet above that. However, we have an acute problem with affordable housing in Charleston. Housing is not going to get cheaper because the ocean is rising, and we have this sort of infrastructure investments. We do have a plan to build the first rapid transit line, Somerville to Charleston, up Rivers Avenue. Have y'all been able to identify locations on high ground where we can build high-density, affordable communities for the people that are going to be forced away from the sea before the rich people out at the beaches discover that they want to own North Charleston and get away from the ocean? Do we have places that we can put people where they can get to work and where they'll be safe from hurricanes and flooding, and with high density affordable communities on transit?
I think the best way I can answer that is if you look in our flooding and sea level rise strategy, we talk about high, dry, and connected. That's the strategy and the philosophy that the city is going to take going forward. So I think, to your point, we don't disagree with you that we need to find property that's high, dry, and connected. And connected means, how do we connect it through transit systems? So we are essentially saying the same thing you are, only in a different way, that that's the way going forward that we hope to be able to construct the city.
Everybody's great on theory with affordable housing and transit, but we got to find a place to build it, a real place.
Thank you. So thank y'all for being with us this evening. I do want to let y'all know that tomorrow the city of Charleston will officially be drawing up adoption papers for Dale Morris to be a Charlestonian. And he's been an incredible project leader through this whole process. He's amazing. And as he mentioned to you, he's been working with all our fine staff at the city of Charleston. So many folks on our staff have played a role in this. But y'all, I got to shout out to the man behind me, Mark Wilbert, our Chief Resiliency Officer. He's been incredible through this. So thanks to the Dutch, thanks to the Water Institute of the Gulf, thanks to Wagner and Ball, and thanks to all of y'all for being part of this collaborative effort tonight and going forward. God bless. And we'll be around.